My name is Bronson DeStadler, and I want to welcome you to St. Paul's. We're thrilled to have you here, and we're very thrilled to have this amazing presentation here this evening. A couple of quick notes. You remember these awful things. If you could put it on silence, that would be much appreciated. I wanted also a couple of quick notes. The bathroom, there's only one bathroom, I'm afraid, at the moment. Through this door, down the hallway into the parish hall and to the right. For emergency exits, you came in through the front door. There's also an emergency exit in the hallway. And if you go into the parish hall, there's an emergency exit at the back of the kitchen and at the front of the parish hall. Hopefully won't need it, but it's good to know where they are. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bethany Groff-Duro.
I learned my lesson. This microphone is unidirectional. You have to talk into it just like this. Hello, everyone. I'm Bethany Groff-Duro, Executive Director of the Museum of Old Newbury. It's wonderful to see so many of your wonderful faces here, so many good friends. And I am thrilled to welcome, to present the Heirloom gardener, John Forti, here in the corner. I'm going to tell you some stuff about him first, though. First, I'm going to give you a little ad for the museum. Thank you to all of you who are here that are members of the museum. If you're not a member, please consider becoming one. I would also like to give a special thanks to Monica Roos, Bob Watts, Bill Quigley, and Jane Wild, who are our wonderful board members who provided refreshments for this event and also met you at the door and checked you in. So we can't do any of what we do without volunteers. So we really appreciate that, and nobody volunteers more than a board member. And of course, I'd like to give a special thank you to Bronson DeStadler, the back of the room in St. Paul's Episcopal Church, who have opened up this space for us and for you. They are the definition of good neighbors, and we really appreciate you. Thank you so much. So I would like to invite you to several upcoming programs while we're here. Of course, our signature event is the Old Newbury Garden Tour, which features 12 houses this year. It's on June 10th and 11th. You can go get tickets online on our website or talk to Kristen if you have a check, or call the office. On June 25th at 10 a.m. At Brown Square, we will be hosting a community reading of Frederick Douglass's speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July at 10 a.m. It's a powerful event, it's a free event, and it's sponsored by Mass Humanities. If you've never gone to one of these Reading Frederick Douglass events, consider doing it. Being there in the statue of Garrison is really a powerful event for sure. I would also be remiss, I'm going to back up a little bit and say, if you have any interest in volunteering at the garden tour, please let us know that as well. We always need garden sitters with our 12 gardens over 2 days. That's a lot of folks. So we definitely need help, and you get a free ticket and our undying gratitude. So let us know if you're interested in volunteering. And you can call the office anytime or visit our website for more information on any of our events. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to garden historian and ethnobotanist John Forti, who has directed gardens for Plymouth Plantation Museum, Strawberry Bank Museum, the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. Ooh, I practice not saying the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I almost failed, and Bedrock Gardens. As a Slow Food USA counselor and biodiversity specialist, his preservation work has helped to restore countless native and heirloom plants and has brought traditional artisanal practices to modern thinking. He has won numerous awards for historic garden preservation, most notably the 2021 Award of Excellence from the National Garden Club Association. And his new book is inspired by his posts as the heirloom gardener, John Forti, which goes out to millions on Facebook. We have a bona fide social media star in our presence. And with that, let me welcome warmly my old friend, John Forti.
Thanks so much. And thank you, everybody, for coming out. This is the first time I've ever spoken from a pulpit, so I think I should be speaking like this here in Old New England. Happy summer today for the first day. We had a small frost where I work at Bedrock Gardens in Lee last night. I didn't in Maine where I live, but I'm hoping that's the end of it and that we're really here into the gardening season now. So, first of all, how's the volume? Can everybody hear me well? Okay. So about 5 years ago now, Timber Press asked me to write a book about garden history. And I think all of us are looking at history differently now. But one of the things that I've always valued in the museums and gardens that I've worked in is that we weren't looking at just the lives of the rich and famous, but exploring how people lived from their backyards. And for me, as a horticulturist, how they fed themselves and medicated their families and brought aesthetics to their lives that, you know, today we'd say it's a lifestyle thing, but for me, I love exploring how average people did this. And that can be on these side streets here or on High Street too. It's all the stories layered together. So I asked him if I could write this book instead of another book about the homesteads. And what was born was this book, The Heirloom Gardener, Traditional Plants and Skills for the Modern World. And I kind of think of it as, looking at gardening as a craft, but also in many ways, I think we're celebrating, I am at least, the birth of a new arts and crafts movement in America. And I see a lot of that happening all around the country, and I take great heart in that. And I don't in a lot of the other news, but I do in that. So I wrote this as a very hopeful book about all the ways that collectively we can make a difference in the world, one backyard at a time. So what I thought I'd do tonight is take you on a little tour of many of the chapters in the book, and just give you some highlights from that. So, is this in your way if you're viewing it all? YouTube? Okay. Well, you know what? I actually can't see it from here, so I'm going to try this. All right, are we good? I was also very fortunate to get a wonderful artist named Mary Azarian to do all the woodcuts for this book. And I think, yeah, it really, to me, if I'm writing a book about craft, I wanted a craftsperson to craft the art in this. And Timber Press was really wonderful making it look and feel like I wanted this book to as well. At Rock Gardens, we call the hands in dirt volunteers. And there's this whole bit about what happens when you get your hands in the dirt. I once knew a Wabanaki, or I still know a Wabanaki medicine woman that comes through generations of a family of storytellers. And I decided I'm going to do a different talk now. She had been in a car accident, and she was not getting well, and she kept going through all of these traditional healing methods. And finally she went to a Western doctor, an allopathic doctor, and he said to her, "Honey, you just need to get your hands in the dirt." She said, "I was so pissed at him because all of my friends in traditional arts didn't say this to me, but I needed to hear that." She said, "I got back into the gardens and I found my wellness there again." And I just think for that, we also all rely on gardens in many ways. So I write this book about crafting personal and environmental well-being right in our own backyards. Well, hello. So the book is also, at the core, about sowing a sense of place. I grew up down, way down in the South Shore. I grew up on a river. I grew up by a river, on a river. The river raised me, really, and in an old shipyard. That hadn't been a shipyard for over 100 years, but it had been since the 17th century. It was called the Fox Hill Shipyard. And the fox would still play on the hill behind our house. And at this time of year, the kit fox would come rolling down the hill over the false Canada lilies that would cover over that pine needle-coated hill. And those things shape us. And the same way here at Newburyport, in Newbury, there's a specific landscape that endears us to place. And I write about this in many ways because partly there's a romance to it that I care about the history, but I don't look at history romantically. I think history was all kinds of things, good, bad, ugly as can be, and everything in between. But when we value our history, we care for things of science that there are connections to land and landscape that we can now start to understand, but we've always intuited. In Japan, when I was there was a study going on about what they call Shinrin-yoku, and that's what we now know as forest bathing. How the essence and the essential oils of trees actually affect our mood and well-being. The microbes in the soil are doing the same thing to us when we have our hands in the dirt. Those are part of this. In Ireland, they write about Tenala, the relationship one has with the land, the air, the water, and a deep connection that makes you at one with nature. There's a beautiful way that this was written and expressed that I included in my book from Linda Hogan. She wrote, walking, well, she's a Chickasaw writer, I should start off with, a First Nations writer. And she says, walking, I am listening to a deeper way. Suddenly all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say, watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands. Where I grew up, there were stone walls that ran through the woodlands. What does that mean to you? What happened there before? Exactly, there were farms where there were animals grazing on one side, field crops on the other. The old well on our property told me about why some of these old pathways went through the woods to houses that didn't even exist anymore. The arrowheads you find were a part of it. And it's the nature around us, each plant, the wintergreen, the sumac, the bluebird, they were all part of this region in a way that endears us to place. And I put this up here because I also grew up near, the next nearest house was a 1685 shipwright's house in Tavern. It had the course of the river painted along the dining room walls from the 18th century, and a Roxbury russet apple tree out in front that the entire neighborhood could be up in playing. And we knew those apples didn't look much like anything else we'd ever seen, but they were really good for your teeth, and they didn't need spray because they came from a time before we were chemically dependent. And they told stories to me about the past. The people who bought that house had no idea. They had no sense of place. And they painted over the walls of that dining room, and they cut down the Roxbury russet apple tree. And to me, part of what all of that speaks to is a need for education. And not education that's from a pulpit saying we should have done it this way, but endearing people to place. So whatever that place is that you live, you know the things that struck a chord with you. Those are the places that I write about building from, to make those connections and help bring them back to life. In my work with slow food, I often quote Ralph Waldo Emerson, who I feel like could be up here, standing there with us. And he was a man of the 19th century, writing that if you don't want a prosperous slave plantation owner, you should learn maple syrup or maple sugar so that you keep your farmers in business, your neighbors in business. To me, that's a whole part of the new local economies that is being built right now, that is about craft from nature. And now we can be getting maple syrup and taking care of the environment in ways that feed back into our own well-being and our local economy. So before I really start into the talk, I want to ask all of you, who taught you to love nature and the environment? Gardening. Anybody? Mother, grandmother, I'm seeing somebody point at the one next to them. Neighbor, uncle, Italian grandfather specifically. So, for all of us, I think somebody helped make connections come alive. I've done a lot of children's garden design for that reason. I think it's important that we help kids engage in the landscape. This is one of my neighbors in a hollowed an old apple tree. This is a kid playing in a part of a children's garden that I designed for Mass Court. You know that the commercial would say, this is your mind on drugs. Well, this was my mind on plants as a kid. Those are connections that stay with us. But Rachel Carson wrote, if a child is to keep his inborn sense of wonder, he needs the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, rediscovering with him the joy, excitement, and mystery of the world we live in. Are you all familiar with Rachel Carson? What I love about this, apart from the fact that she was a woman who came up through science at a time that was hard to do, she also created bipartisan legislation that gave us an EPA and reminded us that we need to find common ground around these things, because that really is the one thing we share in common is the earth. And bringing it back down to that level, I also wrote this book in many ways about trying to find common ground at a time when the nation is deeply fractured in many ways. And that's another thread that runs through, is finding those seeds, finding those common places, and helping engage others in it. So what I've done as a garden historian is reach into the past to try to rekindle old ways that we can borrow and apply to the present. Have any of you ever heard of an herbarium? So it's pretty obscure, so for most of you that won't have heard of that, throughout history, late 17th century right on through, especially young women who weren't given the same opportunities in education would often find this as an inroad to science. But men, women, children, everybody would press botanical specimens that they found and then label them. And every place I've ever worked in their collections would have regional examples of herbaria that were collected, and sometimes really fine writing saying, oh, this plant was gathered by grandfather's grave. Grandmother says it's used to make a tea for this, and another one's pressed apple specimens that a kid sent from Florida to his sister in New England for Christmas, and they're backyard keepsakes of place. But it's also a way that we can be reconnecting kids with their own environment. Something I do with adults too. In any internship I've ever run, I have to make an herbarium from the gardens that we're working together in, so that they have an heirloom keepsake. Because through history, most people were heirloom botanists or household botanists, really having to know hundreds, and if not thousands, of plants for food and medicine that were out in their environment. So when you see an image like this one, this is a page from Emily Dickinson's herbarium with Queen Anne's lace and prunella or heal-all and some wallflower. This is Angelica, which, oh, I meant to bring a jar, but I just can't eat some last weekend. And it's a wonderful plant that, again, might make notes in the margins of things like that, which we do with plants. But to me, it's also an important thing to take into the present, because on average, studies are showing that kids know fewer than 10 animals and plants in their backyards, but that they know hundreds and hundreds of corporate logos. That's a disease in our culture. And so by getting those connections rebuilt, helping kids find something engaging outside of the blue screen is a big part of it. It's another reason I write this book, as I do. For me, a lot of this is about fostering habitat where we live, because we don't live in isolation. We might think we put a fence around our yard, or we've got this space, but really, have you ever turned off the lights at night and gone out to hear all the noises that are there, all the critters that pass through? This is community too. What happens in our yard is its own ecosystem, and what we do, how we plant it, makes a big difference. And again, in a world where it can seem hard to affect change, what I love is that I know that my backyard connects with your backyard and yours to hers, and suddenly we've got green belts and watersheds, and every garden club across the country connecting to the next, and you can make an enormous difference this way. So I write a lot about using the native plants, and also ecological practices that help encourage this. I am an organic gardener as well, but I think there are many ways to approach that with sharing. But I have neighbors that put down a lot of chemicals. They don't see this, but on a summer's night in my yard, I must have 10,000 fireflies and crickets and peepers, and the rewards in gardening this way are huge too. It's also the joy that when you know if you're putting in something like sassafras or spice bush, you're going to get the spice bush swallowtail, that crazy little caterpillar that has that thing guy to make himself look really And when you leave the milkweed, you're getting monarchs, and the native lobelias are bringing the hummingbirds. I just saw my first yesterday. Those are a big part of what motivates me to garden with the right plants in place as well. I also love starting with the native layers of the landscape. I think more and more we're learning the value. I'm not a person to say only plant native, but I think it should be an important part of the ground layer of everything. And a major part of it to me is getting to know the plants in place so you realize how many wonderful natives you could be adding to your landscape. But also, where a lot of us are getting involved in school gardens, I love this method of planting three sisters, beans, corn, and squash. It's a great school lesson for kids, but it also works with the school year. You can plant it in the spring, go away for the summer with minimal care, come back to a crop. And that's kind of how these things are tended in coastal communities. But we know that the beans were fixing nitrogen in the soil for the fertilizer. They were climbing up the corn stalks to get light. And then the squash and pumpkins would cover over the ground and keep down the weeds and retain moisture. And today we know that pattern of growing gives you the highest yield of any other method of planting known in the world today, pound for pound. And it gives you a completely nutritionally balanced diet and all three crops in over winter. That's sophisticated agriculture. So I love playing with things like that, adding strawberries into the landscape, things like Jerusalem artichoke and extend crops, and groundnut, Apios americana, that has these cool leguminous flowers, plants like Joe Pyeweed that they used to leave around fields so that the pollinators came. So sometimes it's also not just borrowing from the plant palette, but some of the cultural ways behind how people planted and what they planted. Because as I said, this is a community too, and how we treat our communities makes a difference. You're hearing a lot more about waiting to mow and minimizing lawn, even vegetables, like leaving the leaf litter. That's where most of them are the estuaries for our waterways. When you leave the leaf litter and needle litter, that's where the salamanders and the fireflies and the worms and everybody that we need to be in our yards with us are coming to life. So for me, it's rethinking these things so that, when I first put winterberry in my yard, the first winter I had enough to cut some branches, I put them in the urns outside my front door, and there was a blizzard that came up the next day. 14 bluebirds came in. I'd never seen a bluebird at my house, and they wiped out every berry on that. And you know what they're doing is eating them, pooping them out with a fertilizer packet somewhere else, and growing more natives. That's the big part of using natives, is how they spread on the wind and through creatures that make it a big part of the joy in that. And the same thing happens with our kids and the blackberries they eat. Those are going back out, even if not just attitudinally, knowing where their food comes from as well. I also write about foraging because I think that sometimes if we have gone out to forage, we have a greater respect for where our food can come from and the land it's grown in. How many of you grew up foraging? All right, I see 2.5 hands. I'm going to rephrase this. How many of you went out blackberrying and blueberrying? And we all grew up foraging. It's not in the domain of Brooklyn hipsters alone. When you get that familiarity, you also remember nature as an ally. How many kids today watching media grow up thinking nature is their ally? Everything you buy is a cure for nature, for the sun, for ticks, for mosquitoes, for nature is posed as our enemy. And I think so many kids only know climate control, only know the fear of nature. And I think foraging is a great way to say, no, we're just going out blueberrying. And of course, my nephew will say to me, Uncle John, can I have one of those toothpaste berries? He means wintergreen. But those are the things that when you are learning another skill set, you're also learning respect and inquiry and natural intelligence. So I also write about things where there are things that in nature we can harvest in abundance like this. Who knows what this is? Sumac. Now, how many of you grew up thinking poison, sumacs, all sumacs poison. It's pretty common. Back to that fear of nature first. You probably haven't seen poison sumac. It has white berries, actually. It doesn't look anything like this. But that one seed cluster has 500 times the vitamin C of an orange. So long before we thought we had to import Minute Maid for winter to keep well, we were doing things like making sumac tea or making a spice called za'atar that has sumac in it. Once I introduced a chef to Portsmouth to that, he's now replaced all use of citrus on his menu with sumac as a native thing to people. Again, use local, that's in abundance. But I also write about not using things that have been overforaged historically. I was doing a piece with my friend Kathy Dubs from Here and Now on ramps. And what we got across in that was how easy it is to sow the seeds, to grow a colony, to rematriate them. I have taken 7 little slips of ramps and a handful of seeds, and I now have 12 patches of ramps growing in my backyard. There are wild leek, and they're wonderful. And I don't have to go out foraging in an ecologically, environmentally sensitive place, because now I've replaced something, put it back into my yard where it likely had been, and now it's growing as fast as Lily in the Valley might somewhere else. But you could be doing that with black walnuts. This is a whole community of chestnut in the 19th century. Doing it with rose hips, any number of things. But I try to write about plants that we can also just bring into our backyard, like the ramps. How many of you have eaten fiddleheads before? They're just great, aren't they? I think of them kind of like the moxie of New England greens. They're just flavorful and kind of funky. They taste like bog and greens and marsh. But they're also this beautiful plant that it's art in your food, really. And it's all that vitality of what was stored in the ground over winter that you can add into a pasta dish, or just extend the season. This is also what they would call a spring tonic historically. When you eat those first greens of spring, you're getting all that vitality that was stored underground through the winter. And that's really what this is about, is the vitality when you think of a tonic that comes from these fresh greens. The book's also really about rekindling old ways that, as a historical society, what we cease to teach about, we think about, we forget. And there are so many wonderful ways in the past that I've learned in garden history and as a historian we don't want to lose sight of. Where Shakespeare wrote, there's rosemary, and that's for remembrance. So pray, love, remember, as you take your rosemary back outside this spring. I write about things like raised bed gardening, foraging, how to candy things like violets or angelica, how to build hot frames and cold frames and hotbeds, how to espalier fruit and grow things in an urban setting, but also a lot of the old skills that brought things to market, brought them to apothecary, and not even that far distant in our history. I love these seasonal things that would crop up, like Granny's own brand nettle drink, because it's spring, and of course it's the time to drink nettles. So that's what happened when you had a resilient local economy and you didn't look to 5 major corporations to provide all things you eat seasonally. You ate wonderful things that shifted and actually had flavor and medicinal properties. But I also think of this as not just old ways, but old movements that we keep alive too. Because we've gone through a lot. There were times when kids were working in mills and we had to start a school gardens movement to remind kids, as we need to again today, how to engage with nature, how to grow and how to cultivate plants. During World War II, we had another movement that's one of my favorites to think about and teach from, which is the Victory Garden movement. How many of you have family memories of Victory Gardens? Anybody? What I love about that whole movement is that almost half the nation's produce was grown in backyard Victory Gardens. The nation came together and turned on a dime to shift how we fed ourselves as a nation, because we knew so many of our farmers were overseas during the war. But it also reconnected people to the land They had campaigns on saying things like, get your weapons of war, spades, shovels, and hoes, and kids, get out in your yard, dig up that excess lawn, and plant a victory garden. And it just reminds me a nation can come back together again, and that the soil is one of those ways that we can do it. Just as generations of immigrants and others have done it before. This is Emma Pecunis in her victory garden, which is one that I restored or rehabilitated up in Portsmouth. Sheba Shapiro in her garden, teaching the next generation how to save seeds. So many layers of how we pass things along through history. When I first saw this watercolor at the center, I saw my grandmother, one of them, the skinny one. I mean, not the skinny one, but my Italian grandmother. And I was really touched by the image and the memories that it evoked. How many days were spent shelling beans, tipping and topping beans, and talking. And we'd just be out on the piazza, not talking about politics or anything else, but I love what happens when we just are doing the daily things, talking about the recipe, the thing that's been passed down through your family, the seeds and saving seeds. And I think we need way more conversations about green and red and blue. And these are the ways that it happens. Thomas More wrote, "The ordinary arts we practice every day at home are of more importance to the soul than their simplicity can suggest." I have a family where I don't think there's any adult that survived with a gallbladder in their body. But growing up, everybody knew if you were feeling that kind of pain, you had bay leaf tea. And we always kept bay plants around the house, and that made me understand that plants are medicine. From the time I was this big, sometimes it's just those simple connections that foster trust. I was walking through a park in Maine with some friends, and we saw this crabapple tree, and one of my friends, Betsy Williams, said, "Oh, we used to make pickled crab apples." And I said, "Well, tell me the recipe." And next thing, we're all gathering up our shirts and filling them with crab apples, and we went home and made pickled crab apples, sweet and sour crab apples from her old family recipe. Those are the connections that I love to keep alive, as well as saving those seeds. And that's certainly one of the threads that runs deep throughout the book, is heirloom. So what does heirloom mean to you? Anybody? Old? Okay, well then I'm an heirloom. Let's get more specific. Yeah, handed down from generation to generation. At least 3 human generations. But in seeds, heirlooms are also open-pollinated. Hybrids are genetic clones, so you cannot save their seed from one generation to the next. But when you have open-pollinated heirlooms, every year you do just what my grandfather did. If he would eat the first tomato of the season, he'd smear those seeds on the side of a brown paper bag and write plum tomato, and he'd save it because it was the first tomato in. If he ate a really sweet tomato or a delicious tomato, he'd save the seeds of that. The one that didn't split from the plant that had the greatest productivity, the one that was disease resistant. And ultimately, through every generation, year after year, he was adapting those seeds to his backyard. And that's what all seeds have been through the 19th century. This is a seedsman's chest once we started to create some hybrids that's in the Farm Museum in New Hampshire. But it was still mostly open-pollinated seeds because people wanted that for adapting. And what we've learned is there's this wonderful chart, wonderful and sad chart from National Geographic a few summers ago that shows how we've lost over 90% of the genetic diversity among the crops that fed the world in just the last 100 years. Newburyport had an apple it was famous for. The next town over would have had a salad green it was famous for that wintered well, or a bean that it was famous for. Every community, every county had these regional favorites because climate varies, as do all of the other conditions that we grow in. But what happened is after World War II, most of the seed companies were bought up by chemical companies that only wanted to sell hybrids, because you can patent a And they were trying to do some noble things with hybrids too, but what we lost is over 90% of our genetic diversity. And we started to put all of our efforts into adapting seeds to agribusiness in the Midwest because we were writing off local agriculture, and we never thought we would see local agriculture again. Well, surprise. So what I try to do everywhere I go is find these heirlooms, whether it's something like the 8-row multicolor flint corn of the Wampanoag that I worked on at Plymouth, or the white carrot that came over with the first generation of immigrants in the 17th century, or this package of beans that was found in the walls of a house in Portsmouth from the 17th century that's stitched up in brown paper, like my grandfather did in the 19th and 20th century, with milkweed twine, which he didn't do, he just saved his twine. And they're cranberry beans, which were the beans that were grown in Portsmouth for over 1,400 years, until after the Victory Garden era, and then they disappeared, until we reintroduced them. And now every chef, every farmer in the region wants to grow them and bring them to farmers market and sell them, along with things like the long pie pumpkin that we work to reintroduce. And that can only happen with local agriculture. It's part of what I love about, on those days that I'm holding my head in my hands thinking about the state of the world, I think, there's this whole renaissance happening too. How many of you thought you'd see year-round farmers markets again in your life? Any farmers markets. They're a huge shift. Do you remember food in America in the 1970s? If you wanted to get mushrooms, they only came in a can, and little spongy things. And if you were thinking about tomatoes, they'd be these cellophane packages of 5 pink orbs that were hard as stones. And the local food movement helped remind us that, no, actually, we do have taste buds, and we do have standards for flavor and value these things. And it's helped us rebuild all of that. But also, when you farm locally, you end up caring about the soil quality, the water quality, the air quality where you live, and you become better stewards of it. John Muir wrote, when we try to pick anything out by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And I really think that the local farms are helping us rebuild in more ways than we could ever know, because a small integrated farm can use clean energy. They can not just have a monoculture of 3,000 acres of soybean, but they are growing orchard trees and nut trees. They are, having grass-fed livestock and crop diversity, clean water runoff, homegrown seed, and all of a sudden we're getting bakers using local grains and local beer and all kinds of great byproducts that are coming from local farms. And as this suggests, you're supporting your local pharmacy too, because more and more we're learning about the health benefits of locally grown food. When I first started Slow Food Seacoast with some friends in this region, at that time there were, I think, about 1,200 farmers markets across America. That's just 15 years ago. Last year there were over 24,000 farmers markets in America. That's a huge, huge shift for a nation. And organic is the largest growing market segment of produce in America at about 15% now. So these are huge shifts that are coming about that couldn't have happened through agribusiness in one part of the country. But we're also finding it leads to ingenuity that's regional. Everywhere you go, people are rethinking the best way to do things sustainably in that place. I also love that Michael Pollan quoted me quoting my little old Italian grandmother depicted from the neck down, saying it's better to pay the grocer than the doctor. This is not a person who came to this country with a lot of wealth as an immigrant, but she always invested in the quality of food because she knew that was the biggest influence on health. And I think the farmers markets are reminding us of that. Not just the fresh greens and all, but all the value-added produce that farmers are learning to bring to market to help them get through the year. And as May Sarton wrote, everything that slows us down and forces patience, everything that sends us back into the slow circles of nature is a help. Gardening, therefore, is an instrument of grace. When you live in a culture that's speeding by you all the time, Sometimes it's really good to take back that pace of a farm and a garden and make the pace your own. I'll talk about it in a minute too, but during the pandemic, one of the things that I loved most was when I was staying home, I relearned the pace my body wanted me to go at, the way the day should flow in more in sync with the nature of the hours of the day and the light in the day, and we can lose touch of that, and that's why slow food really came about in the world of fast food, just to say, no, this is also about the pace, this is about community. Talk to each other, slow down, sit around the table, don't eat over the sink or in a car, but be with each other and support your local farmers, and we build back what's gone missing. Also, I write about things like organic because I don't know anybody that wants to poison the earth. Everybody's trying to garden in healthy ways that sustain. But we were all of us raised in a generation that got had ads that told us better living through science meant you dumped a lot of chemicals in your garden. And that's really not what better living through science means, but we're all able to share what we know and bring back and also develop new sustainable ways. Every garden site that I've run in New England, I've run as an organic garden. And you've probably been to many of them. Did you think they were hideously unkept and terrible looking? No, you can keep a wonderful garden that's also that habitat we talked about. And so I really try to write about ways that are easy for us to practice, that like Emerson's maple syrup, also help us invest in the things that we care to invest in, like our own communities. We're also finding that organic food that's raised not like conventional agribusiness food, fully to ripeness and not shipped 2,000 miles and more like a lot of our food in the market system, can have as much as 70% greater nutritional value than the food that we buy in a supermarket. So that's the investment my grandmother couldn't articulate this way, that science is now also teaching us, is a value that we're investing in when we buy local, or better yet, when we grow in our own backyards. Aldo Leopold wrote, "We abuse the land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. But when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." And I think that's what all of us as gardeners or people that go to farmers markets are really doing. So as I was saying, the pandemic, that might have been a reset button in many ways for a lot of us. And in my yard, if I knew, do you think of convenience food and how quickly we would jump in a car to go buy something pre-made, take half an hour back and forth at least, and at that time you didn't even want to go into a public space, or I didn't. But I learned, if I went up in my yard and made a salad from every single thing that was edible in my yard, I could stay out of the market for weeks, But it wasn't, if I think we're going to feed the world in the future on iceberg lettuce, we're probably all going to die. But when we know diversity in our gardens and our markets, you can put so much more together. But also eat that deliciousness and know that flavor. So one of the ways that was done historically to great effect was in the kitchen garden. Because where do you keep your kitchen garden? It's right outside your kitchen door, right? So it's not often some corner that you're going to forget about it. So when I get up in the morning and I have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, I walk out, maybe I see a couple of weeds that I should pull, so I'll probably pull that, get a little exercise, get some oxygen in my lungs, but then I'm seeing, okay, there's a lot of parsley that's come back, and wow, the mint's up now. I should probably make tabbouleh for dinner tonight, and all of a sudden I'm thinking about the meals that can come from that space, and what I might want to plant in that gap over there, and it's just that idea of having it close by. Whether it's a very simple raised bed garden, like this one that I designed for the oldest house on Nantucket, or this incredibly elaborate kitchen garden outside a house in Belgium. They're all just with this thing in mind that you raise up kids that know how to go outside too, and grandkids, and pick a tomato and save its seeds, or that they know that carrots come from the ground. I'll never forget when I worked at Plymouth Plantation, this kid was just wide-eyed watching me pull carrots out of the ground and say, him by the arm and said, "Not our carrots," and marched off. We've got a serious disconnect problem here in this country. I love that our gardens can help us reconnect with that. This is a thing from the Common Ground there that says, "These greens are here to sample." You know, I love that idea. Again, don't be afraid of it. Teach your kids and your grandkids, and we all end up with the kid that gets it like that. And really, as I said, writing about gardening as a craft, whether it's putting up and canning things, building those raised beds, or learning the science behind it. I showed sage here. So think about, well, how do you know to use sage? What's the most traditional use? Turkey and stuffing. So throughout history, it's been used in stuffing and in sausages. Today, when we looked at the chemical analysis of sage, we find that it's antibacterial and antiseptic. Where would you most likely find bacteria forming in your turkey? In the cavity of that turkey, which is why, you know, most of what people knew about food safety was in the herbs they used or the plants they used. The same way, if my grandmother used a wooden cutting board, she rubbed it with lemon or garlic afterwards, and she had one for meat, one for veggies, and there was just common understanding. Even though sometimes you'll read things like, well, they used to use the flavor of herbs and spices to mask the flavor of rotting meats. People didn't eat rotting food any more than we do. But what we're looking at in the chemical analysis of those plants is that they were preservatives. And then even things like the cayenne that you see more of in a hot culture, you might think, why are they using hot in a hot place? It's a preservative. It's kind of like fried things at the fair. It's just food safety. So people had a better sense of that. And it was this gardening as a craft. So I put in a quote from the book that I always love from Louis Nizer, but a form of it goes all the way back to St. Francis of Assisi. And the quote is, "A man who works with his hands is a laborer. A man who works with his hands and his head is a craftsman. But a man who works with his hands and his head and his heart is an artist." And I like to think of everybody that gardens as an artist in their garden. You're curating a space, and you're making it what serves you and your family and your environment the best. And I think partly during the pandemic, we all started to rethink our home and our landscape a little bit more like a homestead. How many of you have laundry lines? I love putting up, I've actually always had it at this house. I never had a dryer until this last year. And I like having it because I don't ever want to be an absolutist about anything, but during that time of pandemic, to have the time to aim things to the wind, to pin them up, to take in that freshness, that's a part of my house as a homestead. But I also know that if we didn't have clothes dryers, we wouldn't need a single nuclear power plant in the country. One check mark. Bees in your yard, another check mark. Chickens in your yard, another check mark. Not everything suits everybody, but each of us does whatever little thing we can check off in our yard. And they make an impact. I got a text from a neighbor tonight just saying, "Eat eggs, we got a glut right now." Those are the things that really build community as well as habitat. And so I really love looking to these old ways that taught us how to maximize whatever bit of space we have in our yard, so that we can end up using, just being a little bit more self-sufficient in space that we live, but also, as we say it's slow food, it's a delicious revolution. This isn't something that you have to preach from the pulpit. People taste it, we know the difference. It's a shift in lifestyle, too, I guess is really where I'm going with that. Good. So I try to bring up more of these practices from the past that keep us out of the box stores. Instead of buying a cheap plastic fence, one of the old ways they would do things is to take the prunings from your orchard, the free fall from your yard, and you put stakes into the ground of wood, and you just weave the stakes in and out like you're building a basket on the ground. And wattle is one of those ways that people build fences and arbors and compost heaps, and all of that to me is so much more beautiful, and it doesn't end up in a landfill 3 years if you didn't have to hop in your car to go buy it. So when we can, it's about finding the time to craft a more beautiful space from what we have. Or, I know people that make a living making wattle that they can sell in panels for people that don't have all this in their yard, but they had to prune their orchard every year or something like that. So new industries from it too. It's also building in some of the edibles to our yard that we can enjoy more. We used to have more room in New England for orchards, but you can still put in your favorite apple trees, pear, maybe some peach and quince. Quince is one of my favorites. Are any of you on my page, the Heirloom Gardener, on Facebook? I just posted something about quince yesterday, and I love putting out what's seasonally happening. But there are a lot of old fruits that we used to use that we forget about, and quince is one of my favorite fruits. Even just the smell of it puts me in a good mood, let alone all the things you can make to drink and eat from it. Plants like carrots, and gooseberries, elderberries, and raspberries, blueberries, and cranberries, and cherries. They're all things we grow in our backyards. And even things like this. Anybody recognize this one? Yeah, excellent. They're pawpaws. It's the largest American fruit. And you can thank climate change, but no, we can now grow pawpaw in New England. And it's also a delicious crop. And we have a tree that's less than 20 years old at Bedrock Gardens, and we must get 100 pawpaw a year from that one tree. So to me, it's a nice way to have a fruity landscape that you can enjoy as well. So I also write a little bit about herbalism and well-being. How many of you grew up with herbal medicine? So I think the same people that grew up foraging. So I'm going to ask again, how many of you grew up having mint or chamomile tea for an upset stomach? Let's see, ginger or ginger ale for an upset stomach. Maybe bay leaf tea, like I was telling you about, or beets or spinach for your blood, for iron. Maybe tomatoes or oranges for vitamin C. Garlic or echinacea for your immune system. An apple a day, carrots for your eyes, prunes for God's sake. We all grew up with herbal medicine, but we also grew up in an age of consumer culture where we were told you buy things, you don't trust those old wives' tales. And I think that was a sad part of our history, that we diminished a lot of earlier knowledge, that now with science we can learn what really does work and what doesn't work, and blend historical knowledge with present understanding. The same way we can understand that garlic is it's an antibiotic. These are plants that really, if you incorporate them in your diet, in a culture that says first do no harm, if you're a gardener, you get to start right there with what you grew. That's a great way to go before you dive into the other stuff. So I write about things like herbalism because sometimes, if you know this plant, kale, something like that became the poster child of the local foods movement. Instantly, the pharmaceutical industry tried to turn it into a pill. And we learned those pills did nothing. And that sometimes you just need to eat your damn roughage. And that's what it was really all about. That's the part that helped as a cruciferous vegetable in colon cancer, was eating that whole vegetable. When you buy something like St. John's wort in a pill, it has one of 106 active constituents in that plant, and we don't know about over 100 of them. But plants are chemically complex in ways that we're still only just scraping the surface of. So it's wonderful to know the whole plant, to eat the whole plant, to make teas from it, and then create a garden with your favorite herbal allies. I'll tell you, I used a lot more elderberry during the pandemic because guess what elderberry is good for? Influenza and lung ailments, and so it's a support to your system. I did a lot of other things that were more common sense, like stay away from people and wear a mask too, but those are my support systems. And traditional plants and learning told us that, the same way sage did, the same way wasabi. You'd never have sushi without wasabi because it's a vermifuge. It keeps you from getting the intestinal worms that you get from eating raw fish without wasabi. That soapboard lathers like soap, that comfrey was called knit bone because it regenerates cellular growth. All of these old terms, old ways, science is helping us understand more deeply. The names of things like ladies' mantle, motherwort, ladies' menstrual, means they were for women's health. All this comes back into this book as a way to rekindle some of what we can use today. I thought that came out of the computer. And as we say, if you are what you eat, I love how it's changed through the centuries. The first immigrants here in the 17th century would say the cook is half a physician. Today we say you are what you eat. During World War II, they'd say grow vitamins at your kitchen door. I love this one. Try organic, or as your grandparents called it, food. Or you are what you eat, so don't be fast, cheap, easy, or fake. But today, if we are what we eat, we're eating a lot of petroleum because of what's sprayed on our fields and all the shipping, unless you're growing it or going to your local farm. So we do have great alternatives to participate in. And there's also great reward in local. How many of you would have ever thought you'd have local brews and pubs and all of that to go to? And it's so much fun to see all of these old brewing herbs, because hops didn't come in to popular culture until about the 17th century. But before that, we were using plants like ale hoof, mugwort, ale cost, that even their names told you they were for brewing. And if the spruce tips were out, you made spruce tip beer. If the sage was out, you made sage ale. All these gruits that use other herbs are some of the most incredible flavors you'll ever get. And I really learned that I actually do like beer when it's good. So the local beer has done a lot with that. And I've actually had fun brewing now for 3 presidents, and a whole lot of brewers from across the country using these old herbs. And making cordials and cocktails out of things like that elderberry, because sure, I can have a tincture of elderberry, but if you live in New England, we've called them cordials for a long time, because maybe if you live through winter here, you need something that's going to make you a little more cordial, or you have somebody give it as a gift, or they come to your house in winter. So the cordial just has a little sweetness in it, like honey or maple syrup. Last week I made chartreuse while I was harvesting angelica. There's so many ways to play, and I think for a lot of us as gardeners, we want to know how to use the things we grow, and the book is full of that. These are fun cocktails we made last year at Celia Thaxter's garden out on Appledore Island. And every fall, through the Marine Shoals Lab with Cornell and UNH, I'm part of a leadership team that runs an Eco-Culinary Institute. With the best chefs in the region, we stay on the island all weekend, we forage, we fish for the things we'll eat, and learn from scientists and historians, and it's a wonderful weekend. So playing with your food is also a part of it. It makes things more digestible. And as Thoreau wrote, we all need the tonic of wildness. So I write about things like tonics and bitters and how to make things, again, like that from our gardens that have a long history. And the plants that we can use. I do a lot of old plant profiles, like plants like neem that you see here, gentian. And really, how to reconnect with seasonal foods. When I was growing up, I think the only food that I thought of as seasonal was rhubarb. It only came that one time a year, but we were so proud that you could get anything in the supermarket. I remember my father's mother was just like, it meant the world to her that you could get peas in a can and spinach in a can. How many of you think those are more delicious than the fresh peas and spinach you get? But for that first generation that thought they were defying the seasons, of course they thought they were the bee's knees. But once you can taste and remember the difference again, and you don't know that scarcity, it's really nice to reconnect with the real source of things. So I write a lot about seasonal foods and plants that help bring that back. So it's not just the rhubarb and the strawberry, but the first perennial greens that we could be eating 10 months a year into the winter, and how to make lavender wands when the lavender's out, and maple syrup when those trees are running, and how to follow this whole wheel of life that we used to think of as the year. Writing about things like May Day celebrations where we would candy the angelica, we would make May wine with sweet woodruff and sorrel soup from those first leaves of sorrel and the first asparagus. Bring May baskets to neighbors to share with those that didn't get out as quickly into the year. I try to rekindle a lot of those old seasonal markers in what I write. And also remind us of things like wreaths that we can be making from our environment. Because throughout history, a wreath was seen as that portal that you put on your door that reminded you of that wheel of life. Because when you know you keep moving through the seasons and the passages of time, even when it's winter or spring and you think, oh my God, spring's never going to come, you're over here on the wreath, but spring is going to come around and you know you keep cycling through. And those are the reminders that living like this takes us into, that you do keep moving through administrations, through world events, through a bad crop, whatever it might be. And try to celebrate with those little details. When I came in, Jane had a bouquet at the back with a lot of wonderful plants in it, including this one. Does anybody know what this is? How many of you have eaten the flowers of Solomon's seal? You can't buy those things at a supermarket, but it's one of the most delicious edible flowers I know. They're like candy from the garden. They're sweet and kind of like a garden pea at the same time. But they're beautiful, so I put them on salads. I put them on top of cold soups. I just eat them in the garden. You can use edible flowers on butters and cheeses and ice cubes in your salads, on honey. I made a violet syrup a few weeks ago. Chive blossom vinegar is in season now. So it's playing with all these things that when I was a kid we were told to pinch off and throw in the compost pile because they were sapping the plant of its energy. Well, all the old herbalists would say that's the sweetest energy of the plant. You would never consider wasting that. But we also think a salad is 4 wedges of iceberg today with a wedge of tomato. But that's more what salads were like when we made a compound salad in the past. A little of everything we could get that day. And they also had goofy things like the language of flowers, because they remembered plants talk, they tell us stories. And by the 19th century, they got as ridiculous as emojis today, but they were kind of the emoji of the 19th century. People were sending little messages back and forth to each other without words, but they were all encoded in the flowers. And that worked all around the world. People, what does a red rose mean to you? It means the same thing everywhere in the world. And that was before a written word. But a lot of them also got drilled down with words in the 19th century, so it was all over the map. But I write about things like that to keep it fun. And people making those posies and tussy-mussies that would be sent like messages. But plants like forget-me-not know the meaning of that. Or violets were thought to be most evocative. And today, we know you can only hold the scent of violet for 7 seconds. And then it goes away, and it comes back. Goes away, and that's why it was thought to be such a seductive perfume. And where do you put perfume? You put it on your pulse points, because every time your blood pulses, it renews and puts that back out into the air. These are all old ways that everybody knew. We just forget in time. So I try to write about them, keep them alive. But also help us rethink things today. We were all raised in the age of massive lawns. I grew up in an age of weed whackers. How many of you knew a weed whacker when you were young? When I grew up, there were fields of goldenrod and aster and grasses and brambles, and that's where most of our biodiversity is going away. When I retire my weed whacker, this is more what the margins start to look like in my yard. That's one of my favorite cuts in the book from Mary's area. That's my lawn today. A little patch. I've probably reduced it by 2/3 since I moved into my house by just planting the edges and moving the trees in and the perennials in and the gardens in. So there's far less need for lawn. I have way more productive plants that take care of themselves. But also I get pollinators like crazy, and I get a lawn that I can make violet syrup from, and I can dig dandelion greens and make dandelion root tea from. And all of that, started in the 19th century when we got lawnmowers, and people thought that a lawn was a symbol of your newfound leisure class life as an American citizen. How many of you feel like you got leisure time because of your lawn? It's a failed concept, and it was a water hog and a chemical dump. So sometimes I try to use this to write about shifts that we can also be a part of that improve improve things for us as well. Because when I leave the milkweed, that's flying down the river or taking root somewhere else. When I don't weed whack the margins, that's what grows up along the river's edge at my house. The Joe Pye weed and ironweed and spirea. And that's who comes out at night, by day, the crickets. This quote from E.B. White says it all for me. I would feel more optimistic about a bright future for man if he spent less time proving that he can outwit nature and more time tasting her sweetness and respecting her seniority. So I want to ask all of you to think back to who taught you to love gardens and nature, and ask you who you're mentoring now. This next generation of kids really needs us to make connections, and they're eager for it. They're way brighter than my generation about connections to the earth. But they're also stuck in deep in this consumer culture and on their computers and phones. But they're looking for people who have this kind of knowledge in their head, because you do acquire more knowledge as you get older as a gardener. And they're hungry for it. They're becoming the farmers that are feeding our generations, the ones that are going to be taking care of us and inheriting all this. So I love for us to all think on how we can better engage the same ones that taught you. That instead of being the aunts and uncles and grandparents, the nieces, the nephews, the neighbors, the kids, the grandkids, that we can reach out to and help make a difference. And if they pull out their phone to look it up, maybe we're going to learn something from that too. As much as my gut instinct says, put that away, we're out in nature. It's that back and forth learning, because there is something that every generation is going to bring to this. So if you aren't on there, hop onto that dreaded phone. Whoops. That's my page. It's called the Heirloom Gardener, John Forti, on Facebook. And every day I'll post something that connects you to a season and place and ideas like this. My book is in libraries. It's in your local bookstores. Share it among friends. If you don't have a copy, I have a few tonight. If you brought a copy, I'm glad to sign them as well. I can be a little primitive this way. I only take cash. So if you want, I'll give you back with that. And as Emerson said, the beginning of an entire forest comes in one acorn. And as somebody else who I don't remember who it is said right now, all ideas came into being by one nut speaking out loud. If you haven't been also, this is the garden where I work as the executive director. I left Massachusetts Horticultural Society to go to this place because it's like nothing I've ever seen. Have any of you ever been to Bedrock Gardens? It's in Lee, New Hampshire. It had been a private garden until, recently the board, that was a nonprofit, formed 6 years now, I guess. Wow. Ago they recruited a new founding director, and it's been created by a couple over the last 35 years. She's an amazing, she does the welding and the art, and she likes to say she's the problem maker and he's the problem solver. She's a clinical psychologist, he's a family doctor, they're both retired now. But then she decided welding would be interesting, so she took up welding. Then she decided that she should go on to landscape design school, so she went to Radcliffe. And, with these low-pressure careers and all, they had all the time in the world to do this on 37 acres. But it's just this crazy, beautiful landscape journey that takes you room by room through so many different types of landscape, everything with its own emotion. And you really, as our volunteer coordinator says, you come out with your blood pressure 20 points lower. It's just that kind of place. So if you haven't been, look it up in Lee, New Hampshire, and look up the schedule. I'm doing a tour Sunday if you happen to be around Sunday morning, but there are lots of great things on the schedule. So anyways, with that,